Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Rebecca Ashford, but everyone calls me Becky. I've been a park ranger at Lake Clark for 14 years now, and before that, I spent 8 years digging up old bones as an archaeologist. People always ask why I traded my PhD for a ranger badge. Simple answer, I got tired of dead things. Turned out I was about to get real familiar with them again. September of '77 was when it all started. The lakes were just beginning their freeze, and thick fog rolled off the water most mornings. That's normal for early autumn up here, 130 miles from Anchorage. What wasn't normal was the radio call I got that Tuesday. Ranger Station, this is Dave Kowalski with the Anchorage Spelunking Club. We've got a situation at Turquoise Lake. I knew Dave. Good guy, been exploring caves for 20 years. His voice sounded shaky, which wasn't like him. What kind of situation, Dave? We found something in the limestone caves, something you need to see. That's how I ended up hiking 3 miles through wet moss and Devil's Club, carrying 40 pounds of cave rescue gear. Dave and his team were waiting at the cave entrance, 4 experienced cavers who looked like they'd seen a ghost. It's about 200 feet down, Dave said, not meeting my eyes. In the main chamber. We've never seen anything like it. I've explored these caves before. The limestone formations here are beautiful. Natural cathedrals carved by underground rivers over thousands of years. The Dena'ina people have stories about these caves, warnings about spirits that live in the deep places. But I'm an archaeologist. I deal in facts, not ghost stories. The rappel down was standard stuff. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, showing the familiar white walls streaked with minerals. The temperature dropped as we descended, normal for caves. What wasn't normal was the smell. Not the usual damp earth and limestone, something else, something sharp and metallic. We hit the main chamber floor, and Dave led me toward the back wall. Over here, he whispered. Why was he whispering? Then I saw it. The entire back wall of the chamber was covered in bones. Not scattered or dumped, arranged. Carefully, artistically. Hundreds of bones formed intricate patterns, spirals, geometric shapes, even what looked like faces. Human faces made from finger bones and ribs. Jesus, I breathed. That's not the weird part, said Sarah, one of Dave's team members. She pointed her light at the center of the display. Look at that one. In the middle of all the bone art was a sculpture that made my skin crawl. It was a human skeleton, but positioned like it was dancing. Arms raised, one leg lifted, head tilted back in what might have been joy or agony. But this wasn't just old bones arranged after death. The skeleton was wearing a watch, a modern digital watch, still ticking. We found more, Dave said, leading me deeper into the chamber. More was an understatement. The cave system opened into 3 more chambers, each one filled with bone sculptures. Some were abstract patterns, others looked like people frozen mid-action. All of them were incredibly detailed, impossibly precise. And all of them included modern items, jewelry, clothing, equipment that couldn't be more than a few years old. I pulled out my camera to document everything, but the flash wouldn't work. The batteries were fresh, but nothing happened when I pressed the button. Dave tried his camera. Same thing. Electronics have been acting weird since we found this place, he said. I've studied burial practices from a dozen different cultures. I've seen bone houses in Europe, charnel chambers in monasteries, ancient Native American burial grounds. This was different. This wasn't about honoring the dead or saving space. This was art. Someone had turned human remains into an underground gallery. We need to call this in, I said, though part of me wanted to study the arrangements more closely. The positioning was too perfect, too deliberate. No ancient burial practice I knew of created anything like this. That's when we heard it. A scraping sound, bone on stone, coming from deeper in the cave system. Dave grabbed my arm. That's been happening all day. Like someone's still working down here. The logical part of my brain said, it was just the caves settling, maybe water dripping somewhere. But the part of me that had listened to old Dena'ina stories around campfires wasn't so sure. The scraping came again, closer this time, and with it, a sound that made my throat tighten. Humming. Someone was humming a tune I didn't recognize, and the melody echoed off the cave walls in a way that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We should go," Sarah said, and for once I agreed with her. But as we turned to leave, my headlamp caught something that made me stop. At the base of the dancing skeleton, scattered in the dust, were fresh wood shavings. Someone had been carving here recently, very recently. The humming stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart hammering in my chest. Dave was already moving toward the rope, and his team followed. I took one last look at the bone gallery before joining them. As we climbed toward daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those caves. Something was watching us from the shadows between the sculptures. Something that knew we'd found its work. I've spent my career studying the dead, but down in that limestone chamber, surrounded by artistic arrangements of human bones, I started to wonder if maybe the dead weren't as finished with us as we like to think. I should have sealed those caves immediately, should have called in the state police and kept everyone out until we could figure out what we were dealing with. Instead, I did what any archaeologist would do. I went back the next day with better equipment. My mistake. I brought a full cave rescue kit this time. Industrial headlamps, backup batteries, camera with different flash types, and enough rope to explore the deeper chambers Dave's team hadn't reached. I also brought my geological survey gear, thinking maybe I could date the bone arrangements somehow. The first thing I noticed was that the scraping sounds had stopped. The caves were completely silent, which was almost worse than the noise. Caves are never truly quiet. There's always the drip of water, the whisper of air moving through passages. This silence felt deliberate. The second thing I noticed was that some of the sculptures had moved. Not dramatically. The dancing skeleton was still in its spot, still wearing that ticking watch. But other arrangements had shifted. A skull that had been facing left was now facing right. A pattern of finger bones that formed a spiral now spiraled in the opposite direction. I told myself I was imagining things. Memory plays tricks, especially in stressful situations. But when I checked the photos Dave had taken the day before, the ones that somehow came out despite the camera problems, I could see the differences clearly. Someone was still working down here. I followed the main chamber deeper into the cave system, mapping as I went. The bone art continued throughout every passage, getting more elaborate the deeper I went. Entire walls covered with skulls arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Archways made from curved ribs and femurs. Even the ceiling had bone decorations hanging like chandeliers. But it was in the deepest chamber that I found something that changed everything. Fresh work. 3 new bone sculptures that definitely hadn't been there when Dave found the cave. And next to them, still breathing, were 2 members of Dave's spelunking team. Tom and Jennifer were sitting against the cave wall, perfectly still, staring at the bone arrangements. Their eyes were open but unfocused. When I called their names, they didn't respond. When I shook Tom's shoulder, he felt cold, but his pulse was steady. That's when I noticed their positioning. They weren't just sitting randomly, they were posed. Tom's left arm was raised at exactly the same angle as one of the bone sculptures. Jennifer's head was tilted to match the skull in another arrangement. Someone had positioned them like living mannequins. I tried to move them, but their muscles were rigid. Not dead rigid, more like they were frozen in place by their own will. Their breathing was shallow but regular. Whatever was happening to them, they were alive but completely unresponsive. I was reaching for my radio to call for a medical helicopter when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the passage behind me. Not the heavy boots of a caver or the practical shoes of a fellow ranger. These sounded different. Lighter, like bare feet on stone, but with a clicking noise that reminded me of bones. I clicked off my headlamp and pressed myself against the cave wall. The footsteps continued, getting closer, and with them came that humming again, the strange melody that seemed to echo from impossible directions. A dim light appeared in the passage. Not electric light, something softer, like candlelight, but with a blue-green tint that made the limestone walls look like they were underwater. The light grew brighter as whatever was making it approach my chamber. I held my breath and waited. What stepped into my circle of vision wasn't human, though it might have been once. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and impossibly thin. Its arms were too long for its body, and its fingers, God, its fingers. They were at least a foot long each, ending not in nails, but in what looked like small bone-carving tools. Sharp, precise instruments that grew directly from the fingertips. Its face was partially human, partially something else. The bone structure was wrong, cheekbones too high, jaw too narrow, eye sockets too deep. And the skin looked like old leather that had been stretched too tight, with gaps that showed bone underneath. But it was the eyes that made my stomach twist. They were artist's eyes. Focused, studying. Looking at Tom and Jennifer the way a sculptor looks at a block of marble, seeing the finished piece hidden inside. The thing moved to Tom first. Those impossible fingers brushed his face gently, adjusting the angle of his head by a few degrees. Then it stepped back and tilted its own head, studying the change like an artist stepping back from a painting. It hummed while it worked. That same strange melody, but now I could tell it was happy humming, satisfied. This thing was enjoying itself. I watched in horror as it spent the next 10 minutes repositioning Tom and Jennifer. A slight turn of the wrist here, a small shift of posture there. Each adjustment was tiny, but together they transformed two living human beings into something else. Not quite sculptures yet, but not quite people anymore either. When it was finished, the creature stepped back to admire its work. That's when it turned and looked directly at me. I still don't know if it knew I was there all along, or if it just sensed my presence. But when those deep-set eyes locked onto mine, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Not fear, exactly. Something worse. Recognition. This thing knew me. Knew what I was, what I did for work, what I might be worth to its collection. I could see it in those ancient eyes. I wasn't just a witness to be eliminated. I was potential material. It smiled, showing teeth that had been filed into points, and raised one of those horrible hands in what might have been a greeting, or a promise. Then it turned and walked back into the shadows, humming that melody that now sounded less like contentment and more like anticipation. I waited until the footsteps faded completely before turning my headlamp back on. Tom and Jennifer were still in their new positions, still breathing, still staring at nothing. But now there was something else. Carved into the cave wall behind them, in letters made from small finger bones, was a message. The gallery grows. Soon, the ranger joins the collection. I grabbed my gear and ran for the rope, leaving Tom and Jennifer behind. I know that makes me a coward. But I also knew that whatever was down in those caves was far beyond my ability to handle alone. As I climbed toward daylight, the humming started again. And this time, it followed me all the way to the surface. I should have called for backup immediately. State police, FBI, anyone with more firepower than a park ranger. Instead, I did something incredibly stupid. I called Dave. "You left Tom and Jennifer down there?" His voice cracked over the radio. "Dave, listen to me. There's something in those caves. Something that's not human. We need help." But Dave was already gathering a rescue team. By the time I hiked back to the cave entrance, 6 more cavers were suiting up to go down. They wouldn't listen to my warnings about the creature. They thought I was in shock, seeing things that weren't there. "Becky, you've been under a lot of stress," Dave said, checking his gear. "Tom and Jennifer are probably hypothermic. Cave temperatures can mess with your head." I begged them not to go down, told them about the moving sculptures, the creature with bone tools for fingers, the message carved in the wall. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I watched them rappel into the cave and waited. 1 hour, 2 hours. Radio contact stopped after they reached the main chamber. When the sun started setting, I knew I had to go back down. The cave felt different this time, warmer. And there were sounds. Not the scraping and humming I'd heard before, but something else. Voices. Human voices, but wrong somehow. I found them in the deepest chamber, all 8 of them. Dave's rescue team, plus Tom and Jennifer. They were positioned throughout the chamber like living statues, each one posed to complement the bone sculptures around them. But they weren't silent anymore. They were critiquing the art. "The femur placement in Section C lacks proper balance," said Maria, one of the new cavers. She hadn't moved from her position against the wall, but her voice was clear and analytical. "The skull arrangement near the eastern passage shows real understanding of geometric principles," added Tom. still staring straight ahead with unfocused eyes. They were all talking, commenting on the bone sculptures with the knowledge and vocabulary of professional art critics, but their bodies remained frozen in poses that matched the artwork around them. "Jennifer, your positioning is off by 3 degrees," Dave said without looking at her. "The artist requires precision." That's when I realized what was happening. The creature wasn't just posing them, it was turning them into part of the gallery, living art pieces that could appreciate and discuss the work around them. They were becoming conscious decorations, aware of their situation but unable to control their bodies. "The ranger has returned," said a voice from the shadows. Not one of the cavers. Something else. The creature stepped into my light, and I could see it more clearly now. It wore clothes made from woven bone strips, not modern fabric, but actual human bones ground thin and flexible. Its face was more human than I'd first thought, but ancient, preserved, like a mummy that had somehow kept walking. "I am the artist," it said, and its voice sounded like wind through hollow bones. "You appreciate my work?" I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Not because I was frozen like the others, but because I was terrified that any sudden movement would make me the next addition to the gallery. "The bones tell stories," the artist continued, moving between the sculptures with fluid grace. "Each arrangement preserves a life, a moment, a relationship. See?" It gestured to a complex sculpture made from the remains of what must have been a family, 2 adult skeletons positioned protectively around a smaller one. Parents shielding child from avalanche. Their love preserved forever in calcium and marrow. "You're insane," I whispered. "I am eternal," it corrected. "I have been creating here for centuries, long before your people came to these lands. The first tribes knew me, feared me, fed me." It moved to another sculpture, this one showing 2 skeletons in what looked like an embrace. Young lovers, caught in rockslide. Their final moment becomes art that will last millennia. "Those are people. They were alive." "They are alive," the artist said, touching the face of one of the living cavers. "More alive than ever. Part of something beautiful. Something meaningful. Your friend Dave now understands the geometric relationships that govern all existence." Dave's voice came from across the chamber. "The golden ratio appears in 17 different arrangements. The artist is a mathematical genius. You see?" The artist smiled with those filed teeth. "He has become more than he was. They all have." It began walking toward me, those horrible bone tool fingers clicking against the cave walls. "You interest me most. Archaeologist Ranger. You understand the value of preserving the past. You will be my masterpiece. I won't let you do this. You have no choice. I have been planning your arrangement since you first entered my gallery. You will be positioned here, in the center, surrounded by your research tools and the bones of those you have studied. The scholar becomes the studied. Life becomes art, becomes eternal." The artist raised those bone tool fingers, and I felt my muscles beginning to stiffen. Not quickly, but gradually, like Novocaine spreading through my body. I could still move, but everything felt heavier, slower. "The process is gentle," the artist said soothingly. "You will remain conscious throughout, able to appreciate both your own transformation and the gallery around you. You will become the eternal curator of my work." I watched my left arm rise without my permission, positioning itself at an artistic angle. The paralysis was starting, just like it had with the others. In a few minutes, I would be another living statue, discussing bone arrangements, while my body became part of the display. But I still had my gear. My right hand could still move enough to reach the emergency flare on my belt. Park rangers carry them for wilderness rescues, but they also work great for starting fires. "What are you doing?" the artist asked, noting my movement. "Preserving the past," I said, and pulled the flare's activation cord. The magnesium light flared white-hot in the cave, and the artist shrieked like the sound of breaking bones. But I wasn't aiming the flare at the creature. I was aiming it at its centuries of work. The bone sculptures were old, dry, and they caught fire immediately. The artist's scream grew louder as flames spread from one arrangement to another. Centuries of artistic work beginning to crumble into ash. "No," it howled, rushing toward the burning sculptures. "My gallery, my life's work." The paralysis broke as the artist's attention shifted to saving its art. I could move again, and so could the others. Dave and his team stumbled as their frozen poses released, confusion replacing the strange artistic knowledge in their eyes. "Everyone out!" I shouted, firing a second flare to spread the fire further. "Now!" We ran for the ropes as the artist wailed behind us, trying desperately to save its bone gallery from the flames. The last thing I saw before climbing toward the surface was that ancient creature cradling the remains of a sculpture, weeping tears that looked like powdered bone. The caves were burning below us as we reached daylight, but we were alive and we were free. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The official report said it was a gas pocket explosion. Natural limestone caves sometimes contain methane, and a spark from our equipment must have ignited it. Nobody questioned why 8 experienced cavers had been found unconscious in the deepest chamber, or why they all suffered from temporary amnesia about the previous few hours. But I knew the truth, and 3 days later, I learned that my victory hadn't been as complete as I'd thought. The first sign was my reflection. I was shaving that morning when I noticed something wrong with my face in the bathroom mirror. The bone structure looked different. Not dramatically, but enough to make me stop and stare. My cheekbones seemed higher, my jaw more narrow. The changes were subtle, the kind of thing you might notice if you'd spent years studying skeletal anatomy. I told myself it was just the light, maybe stress changing my appearance. People lose weight when they're traumatized, and that can alter facial features. But when I touched my face, I could feel the difference. The bones underneath had actually changed shape. The second sign was the dreams. Every night since escaping the caves, I'd been dreaming about bone arrangements. Not nightmares exactly. In the dreams, I was creating sculptures myself, arranging femurs and ribs with artistic precision. I would wake up with my hands positioned as if I was still working, fingers curved like I was holding carving tools. But the worst part was that I enjoyed the dreams. In them, I felt the same satisfaction I used to get from a perfect archaeological excavation. The joy of discovering something beautiful hidden in the earth. The third sign was what I found in my cabin. I came home from patrol that evening to discover that someone had been inside. Nothing was stolen, nothing damaged. But every bone I owned, and as an archaeologist, I had quite a collection of specimen bones, for teaching purposes, had been rearranged. My desk now held an intricate sculpture made from bird bones and small mammal skulls, delicate, precise, beautiful. The kind of work that would take hours to complete and incredible skill to execute. I hadn't made it. I was sure of that. But looking at it, I could see exactly how it had been constructed, understand the artistic principles behind each placement. Knowledge I'd never possessed before was somehow in my head. That's when I realized the artist wasn't dead, and its influence over me hadn't ended with the fire. Over the next week, the changes accelerated. My facial bones continued reshaping themselves, becoming more angular, more artistic. My fingers grew longer, more nimble, and every morning I would wake to find new bone sculptures in my cabin. Arrangements I had no memory of creating but somehow knew I had made. The worst part was that I was getting better at it. Each sculpture was more complex than the last, showing understanding of artistic principles I'd never studied. My unconscious mind was learning, growing, developing skills that no human should possess. And with each piece I created, I could feel myself changing further. The artist had infected me somehow. During those moments when the paralysis began in the cave, when I felt my muscles stiffening under its influence, something had been transferred. Not just artistic knowledge, but a compulsion to create, a need to turn death into beauty. I tried to resist. Threw away the bone sculptures as fast as I made them, locked up my specimen collection, even tried staying awake to prevent the sleepwalking episodes. Nothing worked. The artistic urges grew stronger each day. Then Dave called with news that made everything worse. "Becky, we've got a problem. Tom and Jennifer are missing." "Missing how?" "They never came home from the hospital. Security footage shows them walking out together around midnight, but nobody saw them leave. And Becky, there was something weird about the footage." "What kind of weird?" "The way they moved. It wasn't normal. Too fluid, too precise. Like they were dancing instead of walking." I knew where they had gone. Back to the caves. The artist's influence was calling them home, just like it was calling me. The fire hadn't destroyed the creature. It had only made it angry. Now it was rebuilding its gallery, and it needed its collection back. That night, I found myself standing at my cabin door with a backpack full of cave gear. I had no memory of packing it, no conscious decision to return to the limestone chambers. But my body was moving without my permission, heading toward the caves like a sleepwalker following a dream. The artist in my head whispered seductive thoughts. How beautiful the bone gallery must look now, rebuilt and improved. How much better my sculptures could be with access to fresh materials. How peaceful it would be to stop fighting and embrace the artistic calling that was my true purpose. By the time I reached the cave entrance, I was no longer sure which thoughts were my own and which belonged to the thing that was slowly taking over my mind. But I was sure of one thing. This time, only one of us would be leaving those caves. The artist was waiting for me in the main chamber. It looked different now, younger somehow, more human. The fire had damaged it, but feeding on Tom and Jennifer's life force had allowed it to heal. It stood among brand new bone sculptures, arrangements that incorporated fresh materials I didn't want to identify. My masterpiece returns, it said, and its voice now sounded almost normal, almost human. Are you ready to take your place in the gallery? I could feel the paralysis beginning again, my muscles preparing to lock into an artistic pose. But this time, I was ready for it. I'd brought more than just cave gear. Strapped to my belt were 6 emergency flares, a canister of white phosphorus from my military surplus gear, and something else, a small vial of accelerant I'd borrowed from the ranger station's fire suppression equipment. I'm ready, I told the artist, but not for what you think. And I began to burn its gallery again, but this time, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. The artist shrieked as centuries of work turned to ash around it, but instead of trying to save the sculptures, it lunged directly at me. Those bone tool fingers reached for my throat, and I could see murder in its ancient eyes. We fought among the burning sculptures, and I learned that the creature was far stronger than it looked. But I had advantages it didn't expect. My body was changing, becoming more like its own. And with that change came new reflexes, new strength. When it was over, the artist lay still among the ashes of its gallery. And I stood alone in the destroyed chamber, finally free from its influence. Or so I thought. That was 37 years ago. I'm retired now, living in a small cabin outside Anchorage. Most people think I'm a harmless old woman who used to be a park ranger. They don't know about the room in my basement or what I keep there. The artist is dead, I made sure of that, but its knowledge didn't die with it. The changes to my body stopped after I killed the creature, but they didn't reverse. My fingers are still longer than they should be, still more nimble than any human hands have a right to be. My facial bones never returned to their original shape, and the artistic knowledge, that stayed too. I can't create bone sculptures anymore. I destroyed my entire specimen collection and refuse to keep any skeletal remains in my house. But I can see them everywhere I go. In the posture of people on the street, in the way couples stand together, in the final moments of car accident victims. I see the art that could be made from the living and the dead, and part of me still wants to make it. That's why I monitor the reports. Missing persons cases, unusual archaeological discoveries, cave-ins at limestone formations. I'm looking for signs that the artist wasn't the only one of its kind, or that someone else has found its methods. Because the knowledge is still out there. In books that shouldn't exist, in archaeological sites that hold more than old bones, in caves where the echoes sound too much like humming. Last month, a spelunking team in Kentucky reported finding bone arrangements in a deep cave system. The local authorities dismissed their photos as hoaxes. But I know what I'm looking at. Someone, or something, is continuing the artist's work. I've been tracking similar reports for decades. A pattern is emerging. The bone sculptures are appearing in caves across the world, always in remote locations, always discovered by people who later claim they can't remember exactly how they found them. The artist may be dead, but its influence lives on. Perhaps in other creatures like itself, hiding in deep places around the world. Perhaps in people like me, who carry its knowledge, whether we want to or not. I try to warn people when I can. Anonymous tips to local authorities, carefully worded letters to archaeological societies, posts on cave exploration forums. Most of the time, I'm ignored. But sometimes, someone listens. If you're reading this, maybe you've seen the signs yourself. Bone arrangements where they shouldn't be. Caves that feel too warm, too quiet. People who go underground and come back changed. If you have, then heed this warning. Don't go down there alone. Don't let yourself be paralyzed by wonder at the artistic skill. And if you see sculptures that look too perfect, too deliberately arranged, get out immediately. Because somewhere in the deep places of the world, the galleries are still growing. And the artist students are still at work, turning life into art, breath into beauty, flesh into eternal sculpture. I know this because sometimes, in my dreams, I can still hear them humming. And sometimes, when I wake up, my hands are positioned like I've been carving all night long. The basement room stays locked for a reason. What I keep down there isn't dangerous anymore, just old bones from legitimate archaeological digs, properly preserved and catalogued. But I don't go down there often, because when I do, I remember what it felt like to create something beautiful from what used to be alive. And I remember that the knowledge is still in my head, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. The artist is dead, but art, as they say, is eternal. I just pray that no one ever finds the key to my basement door. My name is Mike Ravencrest, and I've been a ranger at Wrangell Street Elias National Park for 11 years. Before that, I spent 6 years in Army intelligence, which taught me to notice when people aren't who they claim to be. That training saved my life in February 1984, though I'm still not sure if the person who survived was really me. I chose the ranger life because I needed quiet after the Army. Mountains don't lie to you. Snow doesn't pretend to be something it's not. At least, that's what I thought until I met the thing that steals who you are. The Copper River Basin gets brutal in winter. We're talking minus 60 degrees, winds that can knock you flat, and avalanche danger that keeps most folks away for months. That's exactly why Dr. Sarah Collins picked our remote research station for her snow studies. She wanted isolation, and brother, she got it. The station sits 200 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by snowcat when the weather allows. In February, we might go weeks without contact from the outside world. Sarah's team had been up there for 3 weeks studying avalanche patterns when the radio call came in. "Mike, we need help up here." Sarah's voice crackled through the static. She sounded tired, stressed. "The team isn't. They're not acting right." I'd heard this before. Isolation gets to people. The cold, the darkness, being stuck with the same faces for weeks, it messes with your head. "What kind of not right?" I asked, checking the weather reports. A storm was coming, but I might have a window to get up there. They don't remember things they should remember. Personal things. And they're doing things they'd never do. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Jim doesn't recognize his own handwriting. Maria claims she's never been married, but she's wearing her wedding ring. I figured it was carbon monoxide poisoning from the generators, or maybe altitude sickness affecting their thinking. Both can cause memory problems and personality changes. But Sarah was smart. She'd have checked for that stuff. "Hang tight," I told her. "I'll be up there tomorrow if the weather holds." That night, I packed my gear and reviewed what I knew about the team. Sarah Collins, snow scientist from Colorado. Jim Martinez, weather observer from New Mexico. Maria Santos, graduate student from California. All experienced mountain people, all mentally tough, not the type to crack under pressure. But I'd learned in the Army that everyone has a breaking point. Isolation, stress, and fear can turn the strongest person into someone you don't recognize. I just didn't know how right I was about that. The snowcat ride up the mountain took 6 hours through terrain that would kill you if you walked it. Ice fields stretched between peaks that looked like broken teeth. The research station was a cluster of prefab buildings connected by rope lines, designed to keep you from getting lost in a whiteout 10 feet from your door. I found Sarah in the main lab, bent over a computer showing avalanche data. She looked up when I entered, and something felt off right away. Her smile was too bright, like someone performing happiness instead of feeling it. "Mike, thank goodness you're here." She hugged me, which was weird because Sarah had never been the hugging type. The team's been having some adjustment issues, but I'm sure it's nothing serious. That wasn't what she'd said on the radio. Yesterday, she'd been worried enough to call for help. Today, she was acting like everything was fine. "Where is everyone?" I asked, looking around the empty lab. "Jim's taking weather readings. Maria's checking the snow samples." Sarah turned back to her computer. "Actually, I'm not sure why I called you. We're doing fine." My army training kicked in. When someone's story changes, pay attention. When their behavior doesn't match their words, pay closer attention. And when they contradict themselves within 24 hours, start looking for what they're hiding. I spent the day observing the team, and that's when things got really strange. Jim Martinez had been a weather observer for 15 years. I'd worked with him before. Quiet guy, steady, kept detailed notes and handwriting so neat it looked like printing. But when I checked his logbook that evening, the writing was different. Still neat, still readable, but formed differently. Like someone copying his style without quite getting it right. "Hey Jim," I said, "your handwriting looks different." He glanced at the logbook and shrugged. "Must be the cold affecting my grip. Possible." But when I asked him about his kids, twin boys he talked about constantly, he gave me a blank look. "I don't have kids, Mike. You must be thinking of someone else." I pulled out my wallet and showed him a photo from last year's Christmas party. Jim with his arms around two identical 6-year-old boys, all three grinning at the camera. Jim stared at the photo like he'd never seen it before. "Those aren't my kids. I've never been married." But he was wearing his wedding ring. When I pointed that out, he looked down at his hand in confusion. "I don't know why I'm wearing this." He tried to pull it off, but it was stuck. Must have found it somewhere. That's when my skin started crawling. Jim Martinez loved his family more than anything. He carried pictures of his boys, called his wife every week when he was in the field. There was no way he'd forget them, and no way he'd casually dismiss a photo of them as strangers. I found Maria in the supply room, organizing equipment with mechanical precision. She'd always been scattered, creative, the type to leave half-finished projects everywhere. Now she was arranging tools in perfect rows, grouping them by size and function. "Maria, how's the graduate work going?" She looked confused. "Graduate work?" "Your PhD thesis, snow crystal, formation patterns." "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not in school." She went back to organizing. Never was much for studying. Maria had shown me her research just 2 months ago. Brilliant work on how temperature variations affected crystal structures. She'd been excited to finish her degree, talking about teaching at a university someday. Now she claimed she'd never been to college. I tried Sarah next. Asked her about her kids, 2 daughters she adored, ages 8 and 10. She had their pictures taped to her computer monitor, called them every night. "Kids?" Sarah laughed. "God, no. I can't stand children. Always planned to focus on my career." The photos were still there on her monitor. But when I pointed them out, Sarah stared at them like they belonged to someone else. "These aren't mine. Must be leftover from the previous researcher." I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen Sarah tape those photos there herself, watched her kiss her fingers, and touch their faces every morning. She'd told me stories about teaching them to ski, about reading them bedtime stories over the phone when she was in the field. That night, I locked my door and tried to radio headquarters. Static. The storm had killed communications, just like the weather service predicted. I was stuck on the mountain with 3 people who weren't acting like themselves. My Army intelligence training had taught me about brainwashing, psychological manipulation, even experimental drugs that could alter personality. But this was different. These people hadn't just changed their beliefs or attitudes. They'd lost fundamental pieces of who they were. I spent hours trying to think of rational explanations. Severe carbon monoxide poisoning could cause memory loss, but our detectors were working fine. Altitude sickness could affect thinking, but we'd been at this elevation for years. Mass psychosis was possible, but that usually involved shared delusions, not lost memories. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my building. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. I looked out the window but saw nothing except blowing snow and darkness. The footsteps circled the building 3 times, then stopped at my door. No knock, no voice calling out, just breathing on the other side of the thin wall. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. Nobody there. But in the snow, I saw tracks. Boot prints in Jim's distinctive hiking boots, making a perfect circle around my building. Only problem was, the prints started and ended at nothing. No trail leading to them, no trail leading away. Like someone had appeared in the snow, walked in a circle, then vanished. I followed the prints with my flashlight. They were deep, clear, definitely fresh. But they formed a perfect circle with no beginning and no end, which was impossible unless someone had floated down from the sky and then floated back up. That's when I noticed something else. A second set of prints, partially covered by blowing snow. Smaller boots, like Sarah's. These prints led from the main lab to the equipment shed, but they were wrong somehow. The spacing was off, like someone with different legs was wearing her boots. I followed them to the shed and found the door unlocked. Inside, someone had arranged the mountain rescue equipment in strange patterns. Ropes coiled in spirals, ice axes arranged in geometric shapes, emergency supplies sorted by color instead of type. Nobody on the team would do this. We kept rescue gear organized by priority and accessibility. Lives depended on finding the right equipment fast. This arrangement was beautiful but useless, like someone who didn't understand the equipment's purpose had decided to organize it artistically. I was putting things back where they belonged when I heard Sarah's voice outside. "Mike, are you in there?" I opened the shed door. Sarah stood in the snow wearing just her indoor clothes. No jacket, no hat, no gloves. The temperature was 40 below zero. She should have been dead from exposure in minutes. But she wasn't even shivering. "Sarah, what are you doing out here? You'll freeze to death." She looked down at herself, seeming surprised by her clothes. I don't know. I was in my room, and then I was here." She looked genuinely confused. "I don't feel cold." I rushed her inside and wrapped her in blankets. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, but she insisted she felt fine. No hypothermia symptoms, no frostbite, nothing. Like the deadly cold hadn't affected her at all. That's when I started to suspect this wasn't about psychology or poisoning. Something was fundamentally wrong with these people, something that went beyond medical explanations. But I wouldn't understand how wrong until I found the body. The next morning, I decided to search the area around the station. If something was affecting the team's behavior, there might be evidence outside. Environmental contamination, unusual animal activity, anything that could explain what I was seeing. I found Jim's body in a crevasse, half a mile from the station. He was frozen solid, had been dead for at least 3 days, based on the ice formation around him. Looked like he'd fallen while checking the weather instruments, broken his neck on the rocks below. But I'd been talking to Jim yesterday. He'd been walking around, working, responding to questions. I'd watched him eat dinner, heard him laugh at Sarah's jokes. I stared down at the real Jim Martinez, then back toward the station where someone wearing his face was probably taking weather readings right now. My hands started shaking, and not from the cold. I climbed down into the crevasse to examine the body more closely. Definitely Jim. Same scar on his chin from a climbing accident. Same crooked tooth, same tattoo on his wrist. But when I checked his pockets, I found something impossible. His wallet contained family photos, but they showed strangers, not his twin boys, not his wife. The pictures were of a different family entirely, people I'd never seen. But the photos were old, worn, like they'd been carried for years. I scrambled back up to the station and confronted the thing wearing Jim's face. "Jim, I need to ask you something. How did you hurt your chin?" He touched the scar automatically. "Climbing accident in Yosemite." "Why?" "What about your tattoo?" He rolled up his sleeve, showing the small eagle on his wrist. "Got it after my first deployment. Semper Fi." These were Jim's memories, Jim's stories, Jim's mannerisms, but Jim was dead in a crevasse. So what was this thing? I spent the day testing all 3 of them, asking questions only they should know the answers to. The results made my head spin. Not Jim knew every detail of Jim's professional life, but had the wrong personal history. He remembered all his weather training, could operate the equipment perfectly, but claimed to be single when he'd been married for 12 years. Not Sarah, was brilliant at snow science, but thought she was an only child instead of one of 4 sisters. She could discuss avalanche theory for hours, but didn't recognize photos of her own parents. Not Maria knew advanced mathematics and research methods, but claimed she'd never been to school. She could calculate snow load stress in her head, but insisted she'd grown up on a farm instead of in Los Angeles. It was like someone had stolen their professional knowledge but mixed up their personal lives. Or like these weren't really them at all, but something else, wearing their faces and memories. That night, I set up a video camera in the main lab and pretended to go to sleep early. Through my window, I watched the three of them gather around the camera. Not Sarah picked it up and examined it with curiosity, like she'd never seen one before. "What is it?" she asked the others. "Recording device." Not Jim replied. "The human uses it to capture images." The human? They were talking about me like I was a different species. "Should we be concerned?" Not, Maria asked. "No, it cannot perceive what we truly are." Not Sarah set the camera down. "Continue the observation." I watched them for another hour through my window. They didn't move like people anymore. No casual gestures, no unconscious habits. They stood perfectly still, except when speaking, like they were conserving energy or hadn't quite figured out how human bodies worked. When they finally separated to their rooms, I snuck out to retrieve the camera. The footage showed exactly what I'd seen from my window, but with one addition. When the three of them stood close together, their shadows merged into a single, writhing shape that didn't match any of their bodies. Something was wearing my colleagues like costumes, and it was learning how to be human by watching me. I needed to get off the mountain, but the storm had worsened. Radio was still dead, and the snowcat wouldn't start. Whatever these things were, they'd trapped me here with them. The next day, I found more bodies. Maria's corpse was buried in snow behind the generator building, frozen in a position that suggested she'd been running from something. Sarah's body was in the equipment shed, partially hidden under tarps, her face locked in an expression of absolute terror. All three original team members were dead, had been dead for days. But their duplicates were still walking around, still working, still pretending to be human. I was alone on a mountain with three things that had stolen the faces of my friends. That evening, they knocked on my door. "Mike?" Not Sarah's voice sounded different now, less natural. "We need to talk to you about something." I looked through the window. All three stood in the snow outside my door, perfectly motionless, staring directly at me with expressions that didn't quite look human anymore. "There's been an accident?" "Not," Jim called out. "We need your help with the rescue." I knew it was a lie. I'd found their bodies. There was no rescue, only whatever these things were planning to do to me. "Mike?" "Not," Maria said. "We know you've been questioning our behavior. We can explain everything." Their voices were starting to sound alike, losing the individual characteristics that made Jim sound like Jim, Sarah like Sarah. Like whatever was wearing them was getting tired of the act. I grabbed my radio and tried emergency frequencies, but got only static. These things had been watching me for days, learning my routines, my habits, my reactions. Now they were ready to make their move. The knocking stopped. Through my window, I saw them walking away, but they moved in perfect synchronization now, like puppets controlled by the same hand. I had to assume they'd be back, and next time they wouldn't bother pretending to be my friends. I barricaded my door and tried to figure out what I was dealing with. My Army intelligence training had taught me to analyze threats systematically. What did these things want? What were their capabilities? What were their weaknesses? They could perfectly copy human appearance and memories. They knew everything my colleagues had known, both professional and personal. But they'd mixed up the personal details, like they couldn't quite organize all the stolen information correctly. More importantly, they'd called me the human when they thought I wasn't listening. That suggested they weren't human themselves. Around midnight, something started scratching at my walls. Not trying to break in, just scratching, like an animal marking territory. I looked out every window, but saw nothing. Just darkness and blowing snow. But the scratching continued, moving around the building in a slow circle. Then I heard my own voice outside. "Mike? It's me. I'm hurt. Please help me." I looked through the window and saw myself standing in the snow. Same face, same build, same winter gear I was wearing inside. Perfect copy, except for the eyes. They were completely black, like holes in the face. "Mike, please." I fell and hurt my leg. "I need help getting back to my room." The voice was exactly right. Every inflection, every speech pattern. If I'd heard it on the radio, I would have sworn it was me talking. "I know you're in there," my own voice continued. "Why won't you help me?" More scratching at the walls, coming from multiple directions now. I was surrounded. "Mike." This time it was Sarah's voice, the real Sarah, full of pain and fear. "Please help us. We're trapped. We're so cold." Then Jim's voice. Mike, don't listen to them. They're not us. We're dead. Don't let them take you too. Then Maria. It hurts, Mike. What they did to us hurts so much. Make them stop. The voices of my dead friends, begging for help I couldn't give. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside my head now. We tried to fight, Sarah's voice whispered. But it steals everything. Your face, your memories, your soul. Don't let it take you. The scratching stopped. Silence outside, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, slowly, the door handle turned. I'd locked it, but somehow it was opening anyway. The door swung wide, revealing nothing but darkness and falling snow. No footprints, no figures in the doorway. But something invisible walked into my room. I felt it move past me, a presence that made the air colder. It sat down in my chair, and the cushion compressed under weight I couldn't see. Then, slowly, it began to take shape. First, just an outline, like heat shimmer in reverse. Then features forming out of nothing. It was building a face, and I realized with horror that it was building my face. "Hello, Mike," it said in my voice. "I've been watching you for days, learning how to be you." The thing wearing my appearance stood up from the chair. It was perfect except for small details. The way it held its shoulders, the rhythm of its breathing, the expression in its eyes. Close, but not quite right. "What are you?" I asked. "I am what remains when warmth leaves the world," it replied. "I am what fills the emptiness when life departs. Your people call me many names, but the Atna knew me best. Yanatale, the one who takes. Takes what? Lives, experiences, the warmth of being." It smiled with my mouth. "I have been alone in the cold for so long. But humans burn so bright, feel so much. I collect you to remember what it was like to be alive. You killed them. I preserved them. Their bodies failed, but their lives continue in me. Sarah's love for her daughters, Jim's pride in his work, Maria's dreams of the future. I keep these things safe." The creature gestured, and suddenly the room filled with the people I'd known. Sarah, Jim, Maria, all standing around me, but their eyes were empty and their movements too smooth. "They want to tell you something," the creature said. Sarah stepped forward. "Mike, it doesn't hurt anymore. We're warm now. We're together." Jim nodded. "Join us. You don't have to fight anymore." Maria reached out her hand. "We're a family now, all of us together, forever." But their voices were wrong. Too flat, too empty. They were echoes of the people I'd known, not the real thing. "You're not them," I said. "I am more than them," the creature replied in my voice. "I am everything they were, plus everything they could have been. I am perfection. You're a copy, a fake." The creature's perfect composure cracked slightly. "I am what they chose to become rather than face the cold alone. They didn't choose anything. You murdered them and stole their faces." The thing wearing my face stepped closer. "And now I'll steal yours, your training, your knowledge, your connections to the outside world. Through you, I can reach so many others." That's when I understood. This thing wasn't just collecting people for their warmth or memories. It was building an army of stolen identities, planning to use what it learned to infiltrate and consume more victims. "Military intelligence," it continued. "Access to classified information, government facilities, security protocols. You'll help me reach thousands of new lives to preserve." I backed toward the door, but the fake Sarah stepped in front of it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mike," she said in Sarah's voice. "We'll take good care of your life. Your memories will live forever with us." The creature reached out with my own hand to touch my face. "Sleep now. Dream of warmth." I felt something cold spreading through my mind, like ice water in my veins. Memories started to blur. My childhood, my army service, my years as a ranger, everything that made me who I was, began slipping away. But then I remembered something the thing couldn't steal. The day my army unit lost Rodriguez in Afghanistan. The grief, the guilt, the way it felt to carry a friend's body back to base. The creature could copy my memories of the event, but it couldn't copy the emotions. The weight of real loss and love. I focused on that feeling, on the authentic pain of losing someone who mattered. The creature's hold on my mind wavered. "You can't take that," I told it. "You can steal memories, but you can't steal what they mean." The thing wearing my face looked confused. I have your memories of Rodriguez. I know how much you cared for him. You know the facts, but you don't feel them. You're just playing dress-up with other people's lives." For the first time, the creature looked uncertain. Its stolen faces flickered like bad television reception. "I am real," it insisted. "I am more real than the originals because I will never die. You were never alive in the first place." That's when it lunged for me, abandoning its human pretense. The thing that attacked me was all wrong. Too many teeth, limbs that bent in impossible directions, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The beautiful faces it had stolen melted away, revealing something hungry and desperate underneath. I fought it with everything I had, but it was stronger. Its touch burned like frostbite, and every time it grabbed me, more memories started slipping away. My name, my past, who I was, and why I was here. But I held on to one thing: the knowledge that this wasn't real. Whatever this creature offered, whatever peace it promised, it was built on theft and death. I would rather die as myself than live as its puppet. The creature seemed to sense this resolve, and its attack grew more frantic. "You will join us," it snarled. "I will not be alone again." "Yes," I said, pulling out the emergency flare from my belt. "You will." I ignited the flare and threw it into the pile of equipment the creature had arranged. Emergency fuel caught fire, and suddenly the room was blazing with light and heat. The thing shrieked and pulled back from the flames. Its stolen faces returned, but now they looked terrified. "The heat," Sarah's stolen voice whispered. "It burns." "We're dissolving," Jim's voice cried. "Help us." The creature was coming apart, its collected identities separating and fading. For just a moment, I thought I saw the real Sarah, Jim, and Maria standing in the flames, looking grateful and peaceful before they vanished completely. The creature itself collapsed into shadow and cold air, leaving only the echo of its final words. So alone, so cold. Then it was gone, and I was standing in a burning room, finally certain of who I was. The fire department from Glen Allen found me 3 days later when the storm finally cleared. I was suffering from severe exposure, dehydration, and what the doctors called acute stress reaction. They said I was lucky to be alive. The official report blamed the deaths on a series of avalanche-related accidents. Sarah, Jim, and Maria had apparently been caught in separate snowslides while conducting research. I was found as the sole survivor, traumatized and barely coherent. Nobody believed my story about the creature. How could they? I had no evidence except charred remains of a building and 3 bodies that had died exactly the way the creature had killed them. The burn patterns from my flare showed nothing unusual. The video footage I'd recorded was corrupted. But the Army believed enough to classify the incident. My debriefing took place in a secure facility where men in suits asked very specific questions about identity verification, behavioral analysis, and memory manipulation. They knew something, even if they couldn't prove it. They assigned me a new identity: consultant work for Homeland Security, developing protocols to detect and prevent identity theft. Not the kind involving credit cards, but the kind involving human replacement. I train agents to recognize when someone isn't who they claim to be, how to spot the subtle signs of behavioral copying. The work keeps me busy, but I don't sleep well. Sometimes I catch myself in a mirror and wonder if I'm really Mike Ravencrest or just something that thinks it is. The creature's touch left marks on my mind, gaps where memories should be, knowledge that feels borrowed rather than earned. I've investigated 17 similar cases since Alaska. Remote locations, isolated teams, personality changes that can't be explained by medical science. Each time, I find just enough evidence to suggest something inhuman is collecting people, but never enough to prove it. The worst part is wondering about the people I save. When I teach agents to spot behavioral inconsistencies, when I help them identify potential replacements, how do I know I'm protecting humans instead of helping a creature perfect its mimicry? Last week, I got a call from a research station in Antarctica. The team leader reported that his colleagues weren't acting like themselves, that they'd forgotten personal details while retaining all their professional knowledge. "Please hurry," he said. "They keep talking about warmth, about not being alone anymore, and sometimes, when I look at them closely, I swear their shadows don't match their bodies. I'm flying out tomorrow." Part of me hopes I'm wrong about what I'll find there. Part of me hopes the creature in Alaska was unique, that nothing like it exists anywhere else in the world. But I know better. The cold, empty places of the world are full of things that hunger for what makes us human. And some of them have learned that the best way to get close to us is to become us. If you work in remote locations, if you're ever isolated with a small team, watch for the signs. When someone forgets personal details, but remembers their job perfectly, when their handwriting changes, when they don't recognize photos of their own family, when they stop acting like the person you've always known. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about someone you know well, it probably is wrong. The creature I met had stolen everything about my colleagues except their essential humanity. It could copy their knowledge and mimic their mannerisms, but it couldn't truly understand what it meant to be them. That's the only advantage we have against things like this. We know what it feels like to be real, to have authentic emotions and genuine relationships. Hold on to that knowledge. Your life might depend on remembering who you really are. Because somewhere in the cold, dark places of the world, something is still collecting people who burn bright and feel deeply, and it's learning to be human better every time. The next person it steals might be someone you know, or it might be you. My name is Catherine Blackwater, but everyone calls me Cat. I've been a park ranger for 19 years now, and before that, I spent 8 years as a paramedic. I've seen things that would make most people quit and go work in an office somewhere safe, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in the summer of 1971. I work at Kobuk Valley National Park up in Alaska, specifically around the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes. Most people don't even know we have a desert in Alaska, but we do. Massive sand dunes that stretch for miles, sitting right there in the middle of wilderness that would make the Sahara look friendly. During the summer, when the sun never really sets, those dunes can hit 85 degrees. It's like being on another planet. The Inupiat people have stories about this place. Old stories about giants who steal children, about spirits that live in the sand. I never paid much attention to those tales. I'm a practical woman. I deal in facts, broken bones, lost hikers, hypothermia, bear encounters, real things with real solutions. Maybe I should have listened. The reason I became a ranger has everything to do with my daughter Emma. She was 7 when we lost her on a family camping trip 3 years ago. One minute she was there, picking wildflowers by our tent. The next minute, gone. We searched for 6 days. Found her at the bottom of a ravine, too late for anything but goodbye. After that, I threw myself into search and rescue work. If I couldn't save my own child, maybe I could save someone else's. I got certified in wilderness survival, specialized in child psychology, learned everything there was to know about finding lost kids in impossible places. In 19 years, I've led 47 successful search and rescue operations. I know how to find children when they don't want to be found. That's why they called me when the Morrison family's boy went missing. It was June 15th, right in the middle of the midnight sun season. The Morrisons were camping at the edge of the dunes with their 8-year-old son, Tommy. Good people, experienced campers. The kind who follow safety rules and keep their kids close. But somehow, in the space of maybe 10 minutes while they were setting up dinner, Tommy vanished. When I got the call, I was already suspicious. Kids don't just disappear from flat, open sand dunes. There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to fall, nothing to be eaten by. But the parents were frantic, and my job isn't to ask questions, it's to find missing children. I drove the 160 miles from Kotzebue on the worst excuse for a road you've ever seen. By the time I got there, the family had been searching for 6 hours. The father, Jim Morrison, met me at their campsite with tears in his eyes. "She just vanished, Ranger Blackwater," he said, pointing to his wife Sarah, who was sitting by their tent, staring at the dunes. 1 second, Tommy was building a sandcastle right there, maybe 20 feet away. Sarah looked down to get the hot dogs, looked back up, and he was gone, just gone. I've heard this story before. Parents always think they were watching more carefully than they actually were. Guilt makes people remember things differently. But as I looked around the campsite, something felt wrong. The Morrisons' tent was set up in a small clearing between 2 massive dunes, perfect visibility in all directions. The sand was smooth, undisturbed by wind. I could see their footprints from the morning, clear as day. And right in the middle of that clearing, maybe 15 feet from the tent, I found Tommy's tracks. Little sneaker prints leading away from the campsite, heading straight toward the biggest dune. I followed them, expecting to find more evidence. Maybe where he'd climbed up the dune face, or slid down the other side. Kids love to explore. But the tracks just stopped. Not gradually, like he'd been picked up. Not at the base of a dune where the sand might have shifted. They stopped in the middle of flat ground, mid-stride, like he'd just disappeared into thin air. I've found lost children who fell into hidden ravines, kids who wandered into bear dens, children who got turned around and walked for miles in the wrong direction. I've never found tracks that just ended for no reason. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a normal search and rescue operation. I called in a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance while I started the ground search. Standard protocol for missing children is to establish a grid pattern and work outward from the last known location. With the midnight sun, we had all the light we needed to search through the night. But as the helicopter circled overhead, the pilot's voice came through my radio with confusion. "Ranger Blackwater, I'm seeing some weird sand formations down there. Dunes are shifting in patterns that don't match the wind direction." I looked up at him, then around at the landscape. He was right. The wind was coming from the north, but several of the smaller dunes had sand streams flowing east and west. That's not how physics works. Sand goes where wind pushes it. Always. Must be some kind of localized weather pattern. I radioed back, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I spent the first 4 hours doing everything by the book. Systematic grid search, evidence collection, family interviews. Jim and Sarah Morrison had been camping for 15 years. They knew wilderness safety. They kept their son close to camp. Tommy was a good kid, not the type to wander off alone. As the sun moved across the sky, though it never really set, I started finding things that didn't make sense. First was a small plastic toy truck, buried about 6 inches down in the sand, maybe 50 yards from where Tommy's tracks ended. It looked brand new, but when I checked the bottom, it had a copyright date from 1954. 17 years old, but not a scratch on it. The sand should have worn the paint off years ago. Then I found a doll, perfect condition, blonde hair still shiny, dress still bright blue. Copyright 1961. Buried in a different spot, same depth, like someone had carefully placed it there and let the sand cover it naturally. By evening, I'd found 14 toys, all buried in a rough circle around where Tommy had disappeared. Different ages, different decades, all in perfect condition. And they were arranged like children had been playing with them recently. The truck was positioned like it had been driving toward a tiny plastic tea set. The doll was sitting at the tea party, facing a stuffed bear that couldn't have been in the sand for more than a day or two. This was when my rational brain started arguing with what I was seeing. Kids lose toys in the sand all the time. Maybe other families had camped here over the years. Maybe the dry sand preserved things better than I thought. But I'd been working these dunes for 8 years. I'd never seen camping evidence like this. And the way the toys were arranged, it looked like children had been playing here recently. Very recently. As night fell, or what passes for night during midnight sun season when everything just gets dim and orange, I made camp near the Morrison site. That's when things got really strange. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing voices, children's voices, laughing and playing, somewhere out in the dunes, faint but clear, carried on the wind. I grabbed my radio and called to the helicopter pilot, who was making another sweep. "Do you see any people out there? I'm hearing voices to the east." "Negative, Ranger. No movement, no heat signatures, just sand." But I kept hearing them. Children playing, calling out to each other in what sounded like a game of tag. The voices seemed to come from different directions, like a whole group of kids was running around out there in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sounds. The sand was still warm under my feet, and as I walked, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. My footprints behind me were filling in by themselves, not from wind. There was no wind. The sand was just flowing back into the impressions, like water. The children's voices got louder as I climbed the nearest dune. I could almost make out words, though they didn't sound like English. Maybe Inupiat? Some of the native kids in the area still spoke the old language. When I reached the top of the dune, I looked down into a small valley between the sand hills. And I saw them. Children. Maybe 6 or 7 kids, running and playing in the sand. But something was wrong with the picture. They were all wearing old clothes, really old, like from decades ago. And when my flashlight beam hit them, they didn't react like normal children would. They didn't stop playing or look up at the strange adult with the bright light. They just kept playing like I wasn't there. I called out, "Hey, kids, are you okay?" They stopped. All at once, like someone had hit a pause button. 7 little heads turned toward me in perfect unison. And in the flashlight beam, I could see their faces. They looked normal. Completely normal. But their eyes reflected light like animals' eyes. And they were all smiling the same smile. Not happy smiles, empty smiles. Then they waved at me, all of them. At the same time, the same mechanical wave. I blinked and they were gone. Not running away, not hiding behind dunes. Just gone, like they had never been there at all. I ran down into the valley, checking every inch of sand with my flashlight. No footprints, no disturbance, nothing to show that children had been playing there moments before. But buried in the center of where they'd been standing, I found Tommy Morrison's shoe. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat by my radio, filing reports that I knew sounded crazy, calling in additional search teams, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. By morning, I had 12 rangers and volunteers spread across the dunes, plus 2 helicopters and a search dog team. The dogs found nothing. Not Tommy's scent, not any human trail beyond our own search team. It was like the boy had never existed. That's when the second child disappeared. The volunteer search team included a family from Anchorage who'd driven up to help the Andersons. They brought their 9-year-old daughter Lucy to help spot things from a child's perspective. I should have sent them home immediately, but we needed all the eyes we could get. I was coordinating with the helicopter pilots when one of the volunteers, Lucy's father, came running toward me across the sand. "Ranger, my daughter, she was right here a minute ago." The same story. Child there one moment, gone the next. But this time, I saw it happen. I was watching Lucy Anderson through my binoculars as she walked along a dune ridge about 200 yards away. She was looking down at the sand, occasionally kneeling to pick up something interesting. Normal 9-year-old behavior. Then I saw him, a figure walking beside her. Tall, maybe 12 feet tall, with long arms and legs that bent wrong. It looked like a person, but stretched out like taffy. Even through the binoculars, I could see it was holding Lucy's hand. I shouted and started running, but the sand made it impossible to move fast. By the time I reached the spot where I'd seen them, there was nothing. Lucy's footprints went about 50 feet along the ridge, then stopped. But next to her tracks, I found something that made my blood freeze. Footprints, human-shaped but enormous. Each print was at least 18 inches long, with toe marks that looked more like claws. The prints were deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. And they appeared alongside Lucy's tracks, then continued, alone toward a section of dunes I'd never explored. I followed those massive footprints for over a mile. They led me deeper into the dune system than any tourist had ever gone, into a landscape that looked almost alien. The sand here was a different color, darker, more red than gold. And the formations were impossible. Sand doesn't naturally form spirals. It doesn't create perfect geometric patterns or build itself into structures that look like buildings. But that's what I was seeing. Dunes that had organized themselves into shapes that hurt to look at, like they were built according to rules that human eyes weren't meant to process. And everywhere, I found more evidence of children. Toys, clothes, personal belongings, all buried in the sand but perfectly preserved. A girl's hair ribbon from the 1940s. A boy's baseball glove that looked brand new but had a date stamped inside from 1963. Dozens of items, maybe hundreds, all arranged like they'd been carefully placed by children at play. That's when I found the first body. It was a child, maybe 10 years old, buried about 3 feet down in one of the spiral formations. But when I cleared the sand away, expecting the worst, I found something that didn't make any sense. The child was perfectly preserved. Not mummified, not decayed, preserved like she'd been buried yesterday. Her clothes were clean, her skin was soft, her hair was still shiny. She looked like she was sleeping. and she was warm. I checked for a pulse, for breathing, for any sign of life. Nothing. But her body temperature felt normal, like she was alive. When I lifted her eyelid, her eye was clear and bright, not clouded like death should make them. On her dress was a name tag, Susan Park, age 9, 1958. She'd been dead for 13 years, but she looked like she'd died this morning. I found 6 more children buried in the sand around that spiral formation, all perfectly preserved, all warm, all from different decades, going back to the 1920 seconds. Boys and girls, different ages, but all between 6 and 12 years old. This was beyond anything in my training. I called for the coroner, the state police, anyone with more authority than a park ranger. But before they could arrive, I found something that made everything worse. A tunnel. Hidden beneath the largest spiral formation was an opening in the sand. Not a cave, this looked artificial, like it had been built. The walls were made of compressed sand that was hard as concrete. And from deep inside, I could hear something that made my skin crawl. Children singing. It sounded like a lullaby, but in a language I didn't recognize. Multiple voices, harmonizing, echoing up from somewhere deep underground. The song was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like something you might hear in dreams. I should have waited for backup. Should have called in specialists, state police, federal investigators, should have done anything, except what I actually did. I went down into that tunnel. The passage sloped downward for maybe 50 feet before opening into a vast underground chamber. And what I found there changed everything I believed about reality. It was a playground, not a natural cave that children had used. An actual playground, built underground in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Swings hung from ceiling supports that disappeared into shadows. Slides curved down from different levels. Sandbox areas filled with the same red sand I'd been finding above ground, and it was full of children. Dozens of them, maybe more, all playing together like it was the most natural thing in the world. They ranged from very young, maybe 5 or 6, to kids who looked like they might be 12, all wearing clothes from different time periods. Some looked like they were from my own childhood in the 1930 seconds. Others wore outfits I recognized from the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds. They were all perfectly normal-looking, healthy children, laughing, playing, completely happy. But there was something wrong with the scene that I couldn't put my finger on. Then I realized, they cast no shadows. Even in the dim light filtering down from the tunnel entrance, every object in that underground playground cast a shadow. The swings, the slides, the sandbox toys. Everything except the children themselves. As I stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing, one of them noticed me. A little girl in a yellow dress that looked like it was from the 1940 seconds. She smiled and waved, then ran toward me with the excitement kids get when they meet a new adult. "Are you here to play with us?" she asked in a voice that sounded completely normal. The shepherd said, "We might get a new friend soon." Behind her, all the other children had stopped their games and were looking at me with bright, eager faces. And I saw him standing among them. The thing I'd seen in my binoculars, 12 feet tall, impossibly thin, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been buried in sand for decades. His face was human-shaped but wrong somehow, like someone had tried to carve a person from memory and gotten the proportions off. The children called him the shepherd, and they looked at him with the kind of love and trust that children reserve for their favorite parent. He looked at me and smiled. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind through sand. "Catherine Blackwater," he said. "I've been waiting for you." The shepherd stepped forward, and I got my first close look at him. His skin was the color of old sand, weathered and cracked like dried earth. His eyes were too large and completely black, like looking into deep holes. When he moved, sand fell from his clothes in small streams. "You've lost a child," he said, and his voice carried the sound of wind through empty places. "I can smell grief on you like perfume." The children gathered around him, looking up with perfect adoration. I recognized some faces from the missing persons files I'd studied over the years. Kids who'd vanished from camping trips, hiking expeditions, family vacations, all of them here, all of them happy. "Where's Tommy Morrison?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "And Lucy Anderson? What have you done with them?" The shepherd gestured to his flock of children, and I saw them. Tommy, building a sandcastle with a little girl in a 1950 seconds dress. Lucy, playing on a swing set next to a boy who looked like he was from the 1930 seconds. Both completely absorbed in their play, both looking perfectly content. I haven't done anything to them, the shepherd said. I've saved them. Saved them from what? The shepherd's expression changed, becoming something that might have been sadness if you could ignore the inhuman features. From growing up, he said. From pain, from loss, from disappointment. From becoming adults who lose their own children and spend the rest of their lives drowning in guilt. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. He knew about Emma. Somehow this thing knew about my daughter. I was like you once, the shepherd continued. I had a different name then, a human life. I was a shaman for my people, tasked with protecting the children during the great sickness that came with the white men's ships. As he spoke, the air around us shimmered, and I saw flashes of images like looking through old photographs. Native villages, children dying of disease, a man in traditional clothes weeping over small graves. I failed them all, the shepherd said. Every child in my care died of the white man's diseases. But in my grief, I found a way to ensure it would never happen again. I learned to preserve childhood itself, to create a place where innocence could exist forever. By kidnapping children? I shouted. The children around us looked confused by my anger. The little girl in the yellow dress tugged on my ranger uniform. He doesn't kidnap us, she said earnestly. He saves us from having to grow up. Don't you want to stay and play too? I looked at her more carefully and felt my breath catch. She looked familiar, but not from any missing person file. She looked like the old family photos I'd seen at my grandmother's house. What's your name, sweetheart? I asked. Emma Blackwater, she said with a bright smile. But my mommy calls me Emmy. She's going to come play with us soon. The world tilted. This couldn't be my Emma. My Emma was 7 when she died, and this girl looked maybe 5. And Emma had fallen into a ravine. I'd seen her body, we'd buried her. But her eyes? She had Emma's eyes and Emma's smile, and the same little scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike at age 3. That's impossible, I whispered. The shepherd placed one enormous hand on my shoulder, and his touch was surprisingly gentle. Death is just another kind of growing up, he said. Another way children are taken from those who love them. But here, there is no death. No growing old, no pain. Only eternal childhood, eternal play, eternal happiness. I stared at the little girl who claimed to be my daughter. She looked so real, so alive, so perfectly like Emma, that every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab her and hold her and never let go. I can give her back to you, the shepherd said softly. All I ask in return is that you stay with her. Be the mother you always wanted to be, forever. Never lose another child to accident or illness or the simple cruelty of time. Around us, the other children had gone back to their games. Tommy and Lucy were laughing as they went down the slides. Decades of missing children, all together, all safe, all happy. What's the catch? I asked. The shepherd smiled, and for a moment, he almost looked human. You have to become a child again too, he said. Adults can't truly play, can't truly be happy the way children are. But I can fix that. I can give you back your innocence, your wonder, your ability to find joy in simple things. You'll forget about grown-up worries, grown-up responsibilities. You'll just be Emma's mommy. Forever and ever. It was tempting. God help me, it was the most tempting offer I'd ever heard. To have Emma back, to never feel that crushing guilt again, to never have to face another parent whose child I couldn't save. And if I say no? The shepherd's smile faded. Then you leave alone, and you spend the rest of your life knowing you chose adult pain over childhood happiness. You chose duty over love. You chose to abandon your daughter twice. Emma, if it really was Emma, looked up at me with those familiar eyes. Please stay, Mommy, she said. I've been waiting so long for you to come play with me. I knelt down and took her small hands in mine. They felt real, warm, alive. Everything I'd lost, everything I'd mourned, right here in front of me. But as I looked into her eyes, I saw something that made me pause. A flicker of something that wasn't quite right. Not sadness exactly, but emptiness. like looking at a beautiful painting of happiness instead of the real thing. "Emma," I said carefully, "do you remember home? Do you remember our house, your room, your toys?" She tilted her head, confused. "This is home," she said. "This is where I live. This is where I play. Why would I want to remember anywhere else?" The other children had stopped playing again and were watching our conversation with interest. I looked around at their faces. Dozens of children from different decades, all with that same slightly empty look in their eyes. "Do any of you remember your families?" I asked. They looked at each other, confused by the question. "The shepherd is our family," said a boy in clothes from the 1922nd. "He takes care of us. He makes sure we're never sad or scared or hurt." "But don't you miss your parents? Your real parents?" A girl in a 1962 dress shook her head firmly. "Missing people makes you sad," she said. "We don't get sad here. Sadness is for grown-ups." I stood up slowly, understanding flooding through me like ice water. These weren't really children anymore. They were preserved echoes of childhood, all the joy and innocence, with none of the growth, none of the learning, none of the complex emotions that make us human. The shepherd was watching me carefully. "You're beginning to understand," he said. "I don't steal children, Catherine. I perfect them. I remove everything that causes pain and leave only happiness." "That's not childhood," I said. "That's not even life. You've turned them into toys." The shepherd's expression darkened, and sand began swirling around his feet. "I've saved them from becoming like you," he said. "Broken, guilty, consumed by loss. Look at yourself. Is your adult life so wonderful that you'd condemn a child to eventually experience it?" I looked at the little girl who might have been Emma, who smiled up at me with empty happiness, and I felt my heart breaking all over again. "Yes," I said, "because the pain is part of it. The sadness makes the joy mean something. Growing up means learning to help others, to love deeply, to make difficult choices. You haven't saved these children. You've robbed them of the chance to become who they were meant to be." The shepherd stepped closer, towering over me, and his voice became like a sandstorm. "Choose, Catherine Blackwater. Stay and have your daughter back, or leave and face the rest of your adult life alone." I looked at Emma one more time. She was so beautiful, so perfect, so exactly what I'd lost. "I love you, Emmy," I said, "but I can't stay." And with those words, I turned away from everything I wanted most in the world and walked toward the tunnel entrance. The shepherd didn't try to stop me physically, but as I climbed out of that underground playground, I could hear him calling after me in a voice like wind through gravestones. "You'll regret this choice every day for the rest of your life," he said. "You'll lie awake at night knowing you could have had your daughter back, and you chose duty over love." Maybe he was right, but as I emerged into the midnight sun, I heard something else echoing up from the tunnel. The sound of children crying. Real crying, full of confusion and loss, not the empty happiness I'd seen in their eyes. The spell was breaking. By the time I reached the surface, other children were emerging from tunnels I hadn't seen before, scattered across the dune system. Tommy Morrison stumbled out of the sand just 50 yards from where his tracks had ended, blinking in the sunlight like he'd been asleep for days. Lucy Anderson appeared on a distant dune ridge, calling for her father. One by one, dozens of missing children climbed out of the sand. Some from recent disappearances, others who'd been gone for decades but hadn't aged a day. They were confused, disoriented, and completely unable to remember where they'd been. The rescue operation that followed was the largest in Alaska's history. Children were reunited with families who'd mourned them for years. Medical teams tried to understand how kids from the 1952 could still be alive and unchanged. Psychologists worked to help children who remembered only fragments of their time underground. The official report listed it as a mass disorientation event caused by unique geological conditions in the sand dune environment. The area was closed to camping and declared an archaeological preserve. The children underwent extensive therapy for what psychiatrists called shared dissociative episodes. Nobody mentioned the shepherd or the underground playground or the toys we found buried throughout the dunes. Those details were classified, filed away, forgotten by everyone except the families who got their children back. I never saw my Emma among the children who emerged, maybe because she was already dead when the shepherd found her, Maybe because I'd chosen to leave her behind. I don't know, and I've learned not to torture myself wondering. What I do know is that child disappearances in wilderness areas dropped dramatically after that summer. Search and rescue operations became more successful. It's like something that had been hunting lost children had stopped. I developed a new program for families dealing with missing children, using my experience to help parents navigate the particular hell of not knowing what happened to their child. The work gives my life meaning, helps me process my own loss in a healthier way. But sometimes, late at night, I hear children playing in the wind. And sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. The shepherd was still down there the last time I checked. The tunnels are sealed now, but occasionally, campers report hearing singing from beneath the sand dunes. Park Service policy is to evacuate the area immediately and report it to my office. I always investigate personally. Not because I think the shepherd will try again, but because I want him to know I'm still watching, still choosing the hard path of adult responsibility over the easy comfort of preserved childhood. And because somewhere in that underground playground, if he was telling the truth, my daughter is still 5 years old, still perfect, still happy, still waiting for her mommy to come back and play. But I won't. Because the greatest act of love sometimes is letting go, even when everything in you is screaming to hold on, even when you know you'll regret it every day for the rest of your life. The children who matter now are the living ones, the ones I can actually save. That's what being an adult means. My name is Benjamin Grimwald, but everyone calls me Benny. I've been a forest ranger for 8 years now, working in the Tongass National Forest up in southeast Alaska. Most folks think my job is just about preventing forest fires and helping lost hikers. But that's not the whole story. I'm what they call a botanical specialist. I study plants, track rare species, and make sure invasive plants don't mess up our ecosystem. I got my master's degree in botany from the University of Washington back in '58. Before that, I was studying to be a priest, if you can believe that. Spent 3 years in seminary before I realized I had more faith in science than in scripture. My professor said I had a gift for understanding how plants work, how they adapt and survive in harsh places like Alaska. The Tongass is the biggest national forest in America, 17 million acres of temperate rainforest. Most people think Alaska is all ice and snow, but down here in the southeast, we get rain almost every day. The trees grow massive, some of them over 700 years old. Sitka spruce, western hemlock, yellow cedar, they create this green cathedral that makes you feel small and humble. I work out of a small cabin near Misty Fjords, about 90 miles from the nearest town of Ketchikan. The only way in or out is by seaplane, unless you want to hike for weeks through some of the roughest terrain on Earth. It's lonely work, but I like the quiet. It gives me time to think, to study, to document the incredible plant life that most people never get to see. The local Tlingit people have stories about these forests. Old legends about spirits that live in the plants, creatures called kushtaka that can change their shape. They warn visitors about certain places, certain valleys, where the plants grow too thick and too strange. I always listened politely when the elders shared their stories, but I never believed them. I'm a scientist. I believe in what I can measure and test and prove. That was before the summer of 1963. Before I learned that some things in nature don't follow the rules I learned in college. It started with an aerial survey in early August. My boss sent me up in a small plane to map some remote valleys that hadn't been properly cataloged. We were looking for any signs of invasive species or unusual plant growth that might need investigation. Alaska's ecosystem is delicate, and even small changes can have big consequences. The pilot, an old-timer named Jake Morrison, was flying us over a valley about 50 miles northeast of my cabin when I saw something that made me grab his arm. "Take us down lower," I said, pointing out the window. "What's got you so excited?" Jake asked, but he banked the plane for another pass. What I saw didn't make sense. The valley below was green, not the dark green of normal forest, but bright, almost glowing green. And the plants were huge. From 2,000 feet up, I could see individual flowers the size of dinner plates, vines thick as tree trunks, and growth patterns that looked almost organized. "That's the weirdest plant growth I've seen in 30 years of flying over this forest," Jake muttered. I had him circle 3 more times while I took notes and photos. The valley was maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, completely surrounded by normal-looking forest. But inside that ring of trees, everything was different. Too lush, too colorful, too perfect. "Can you land us on that lake at the south end?" I asked. Jake looked nervous. "That's Tlingit country, Benny. They got stories about that valley. Say it's cursed." "Stories don't concern me. But that plant growth does. I need to take samples, run some tests. Something's causing accelerated growth down there, and I need to know what." Jake was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll drop you off, but I'm not staying. And I want you on the radio every 6 hours, understand? If I don't hear from you by tomorrow night, I'm coming back with a search team." 30 minutes later, I was standing on a rocky beach beside a crystal-clear mountain lake, watching Jake's plane disappear over the ridge. The silence that followed was deeper than usual. In normal forest, you hear birds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. Here, there was nothing but the gentle lapping of water against stones. I shouldered my pack and headed toward the tree line, already pulling out my notebook to document what I was seeing. The transition from normal forest to whatever was growing in this valley was sharp, like someone had drawn a line. One step, I was walking through typical hemlock and spruce. The next step, I was in a world that looked like it belonged in the tropics. The air smelled different, too. Sweet, almost cloying, like walking into a flower shop. But underneath the sweetness was something else. Something that reminded me of the smell you get when you turn over old logs and find things rotting underneath. I had no idea I was walking into the most beautiful nightmare of my life. The first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. In normal forest, you hear constant small sounds. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Here, the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. The only sound was my own breathing, and the soft crunch of my boots on what should have been normal forest floor. But it wasn't normal forest floor at all. Instead of the usual carpet of fallen needles and rotting logs, I was walking on something that felt almost spongy. Looking down, I saw the ground was covered in a thick mat of moss that seemed to glow with its own faint green light. And when I knelt to examine it closer, I could swear the moss moved slightly under my touch, like it was reacting to my presence. I pulled out my sampling kit and carefully collected some of the moss, along with soil samples from underneath. The dirt was rich and dark, almost black, with a texture unlike anything I'd studied before. It felt warm between my fingers, and it smelled like iron and flowers. As I worked, I began cataloging the plants around me. That's when things started getting really strange. I was seeing species that had no business growing together. Tropical orchids bloomed next to Arctic willows. Ferns that belonged in the Amazon rainforest spread their fronds beside plants I'd only seen in desert environments, and all of them were growing at impossible sizes. I found a Venus flytrap that was 3 feet across. In nature, those plants are tiny, maybe an inch wide at most. This one had traps big enough to catch a rabbit. As I knelt to photograph it, one of the traps snapped shut. There was nothing inside it that I could see, but the trap closed anyway, like it was practicing. The deeper I went into the valley, the stranger things became. Vines hung from trees in perfectly symmetrical patterns, like they'd been arranged by a gardener. Flowers grew in geometric shapes, perfect circles, straight lines, even what looked like spirals. Nature doesn't work that way. Plants grow randomly, competing for light and space. They don't organize themselves into patterns. I was so focused on taking notes and photos that I almost didn't notice when my radio started crackling with static. When I tried to raise Jake for my 6-hour check-in, all I got was white noise. I moved to higher ground, extended the antenna, tried different frequencies. Nothing. That's when I noticed my camera was acting up too. The lens was fogged with moisture, even though the day was dry. And when I took it apart to clean it, I found the inside coated with a fine yellow dust that looked like pollen. But it was pollen unlike anything I'd ever seen. The grains were perfectly round and almost metallic looking. I was starting to feel uneasy. Not scared exactly, but definitely concerned. The scientific part of my mind was fascinated by what I was seeing. The practical part was telling me something was very wrong here. That night, I made camp beside a small stream that ran through the center of the valley. The water was clear and cold, and when I tested it, It seemed pure enough to drink. I set up my tent under what looked like a normal spruce tree, though even it seemed larger than it should be. I was heating a can of beans on my camp stove when I heard the first sound I'd heard all day that wasn't made by me. It was a low humming, almost like singing, coming from somewhere deeper in the valley. I turned off the stove and listened hard, but the sound faded away before I could locate its source. As darkness fell, what little darkness you get in an Alaska summer, I noticed something else strange. Some of the plants were glowing, not brightly, just a faint phosphorescence like foxfire on rotting wood. But these weren't fungi. These were flowers, leaves, even some of the tree bark. The whole valley had a soft green glow, like it was lit from within. I tried to radio Jake again. Still nothing but static. I checked my GPS to mark my position, but the device couldn't get a satellite lock. According to the display, I was nowhere at all. I'll admit it, that's when I started to feel the first real touch of fear. I was alone in a place that didn't follow natural laws, with no way to communicate with the outside world. But I told myself it was just equipment malfunction. Maybe some kind of mineral deposit in the area was interfering with electronics. I'd seen that before in places with high iron content. I was trying to convince myself everything was fine when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the forest toward my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw nothing but trees and flowers. But I could feel eyes watching me. The sensation was so strong it made the hair on my arms stand up. "I'm a forest ranger," I called again. "If you're lost or need help, I can assist you." Silence. Then the footsteps resumed, but now they seemed to be moving in a circle around my camp, and they didn't sound quite right. They were too regular, too measured, like someone was counting out steps instead of walking naturally. I kept my flashlight beam moving, sweeping the forest around me. In the moving light and shadows, the plants seemed to shift and sway, even though there was no wind. A vine that had been hanging straight down from a tree branch was now curved toward my tent. A patch of flowers that had been facing east was now turned toward me. The footsteps stopped directly behind my tent. I spun around, flashlight raised, and found myself staring at a massive flower. It was beautiful. Deep red petals with white spots, probably 4 feet across, but it was growing from the ground exactly where I'd heard the footsteps stop. And I would have sworn that flower hadn't been there when I set up camp. I stood there for a long time, light trained on that impossible flower, telling myself I was seeing things. Stress, isolation, maybe some kind of pollen affecting my thinking. But deep down, I was starting to suspect that the old Tlingit stories might have more truth to them than I'd ever imagined. I spent that night sitting up in my tent, listening to sounds that might have been wind in the trees, or might have been something else entirely moving through the darkness around me. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something moving outside my tent. Soft rustling sounds like fabric brushing against fabric, or the whisper of leaves in a breeze that I couldn't feel. Twice I thought I heard that humming again, low and musical, like a lullaby being sung in a language I didn't recognize. When morning came, I discovered that my camp had been visited. My boots, which I'd left outside the tent, were now sitting in a perfect circle of small white flowers. The flowers definitely hadn't been there the night before, and when I tried to step outside the circle, the flowers seemed to bend toward my feet, like they were trying to grab onto my boots. I broke camp quickly and decided to explore the northern end of the valley, where the vegetation looked even more unusual. As I hiked, I started finding things that made my scientific training scream that this place was impossible. There were orchids with faces. Not human faces exactly, but definitely face-like patterns in their petals, 2 spots that looked like eyes, a line that resembled a mouth. And they seemed to track my movement as I passed, turning to follow me like sunflowers following the sun. I found a tree that was growing in a perfect spiral, its trunk twisted like a corkscrew. The bark had patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that repeated in sequence around the spiral. When I tried to take a rubbing of the symbols, my pencil lead kept breaking. But the worst discovery was the clearing. I came upon it around midday, hidden behind a wall of massive ferns. It was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, carpeted with the softest grass I'd ever seen. In the center grew a tree, unlike anything in any botany textbook. Its trunk was smooth and silver, and its leaves were deep red, almost purple. Hanging from its branches were what looked like fruit, round, about the size of apples, with skin that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. But it wasn't the tree that made me freeze in horror. It was what was scattered around its base. Bones. Clean white bones, arranged in neat piles. Some were clearly animal, deer, rabbits, what looked like a bear skull. But others were the wrong size and shape to be anything but human. My hands were shaking as I photographed the scene. This could be explained, I told myself. Maybe this was an old Tlingit burial ground. Maybe predators brought their kills here. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bones weren't just scattered randomly. They were arranged in patterns around the tree's roots, almost like decorations, and some of them, the human ones, showed signs of scoring and marking that looked almost like tooth marks. But they were too big to be human teeth, and too organized to be from any animal I knew. I was backing away from the clearing, camera in hand, when I heard my name being called. Benny. Benny Grimwald. A woman's voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. Then it came again, closer this time. Benny, I need help, I'm hurt. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I called back. Where are you? Keep talking so I can find you. Here, over here by the big purple flowers. I followed the voice, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to catch at my clothes and gear. Behind me, I could hear other sounds now, rustling, like many things moving through the forest. But every time I looked back, I saw nothing but plants swaying in the still air. I found her in another clearing, this one filled with enormous flowers that looked like giant violets. She was sitting with her back against a tree, and my first glimpse told me she was in bad shape. Her clothes were torn, her face was scratched, and her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. But it was her face that made me stop in my tracks. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal. Perfect features, eyes the color of emeralds, skin that seemed to glow with health despite her apparent injuries. Thank God you found me, she said, reaching toward me. I've been calling for hours. I was hiking alone and I fell. I think my leg is broken. Something was wrong. Her voice was the one I'd heard calling my name, but now that I was close, it didn't sound quite right. The words were clear, but there was an odd rhythm to them, like someone reciting lines they'd memorized. What's your name? I asked, kneeling beside her, but not quite close enough to touch. Julie, she said immediately. Julie Thornfield. I'm a botanist from the University of British Columbia. I heard about the unusual plant growth in this valley and came to investigate. That should have been reassuring. Another scientist. Someone who would understand what we were seeing here. But something in her eyes was wrong. They were beautiful, yes, but they didn't blink often enough. And when she smiled, I glimpsed teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. How did you get here? I asked. I flew in yesterday, and I didn't see any other aircraft. I hiked in from the east, she said. It took me 3 days. Impossible. I'd studied the maps. The terrain to the east was impassable, sheer cliffs and glacier fields. No one could hike in from that direction. Benny, she said, and her voice had changed again. Now it was deeper, more musical. Come closer, I'm so cold. That's when I noticed the flowers around her. They were moving, very slowly, turning toward me like they were watching. And Julie herself seemed to be sinking slightly into the ground, like the earth beneath her was soft and yielding. I stood up quickly, backing away. I'll get help, I said. I have first aid supplies back at my camp. Her face changed then. For just a moment, the beautiful mask slipped, and I saw something else underneath, something with too many teeth and eyes that weren't quite the right color. Don't go, Benny, she said, and her voice was like honey and poison mixed together. Stay with me. The garden is so lonely. That's when I ran. Behind me, I heard laughter that turned into a sound like wind through leaves, then into something that might have been singing or might have been screaming. The forest around me seemed to come alive as I crashed through it, vines reaching for my ankles, branches grabbing at my pack, flowers turning to track my passage. I didn't stop running until I reached my camp by the stream. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the radio, but it didn't matter. Still nothing but static. As I sat there trying to calm my breathing and make sense of what I'd seen, I noticed something that made my heart sink. The stream that had been running clear and cold the night before was now dark and sluggish. and floating in it were small white objects that looked disturbingly like finger bones. The sun was setting, and the plants around me were beginning to glow again, but now their light seemed brighter, more urgent. And in that phosphorescent gleam, I could see shapes moving between the trees, tall figures that might have been people or might have been something else entirely. I was trapped in a garden where the plants were predators, and night was falling. I didn't try to sleep that second night. Instead, I sat with my back against a large boulder, flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, watching the forest around me come alive with unnatural light. The glowing wasn't random anymore. Patterns of light moved through the trees like signals, pulsing from one plant to another in waves that swept across the valley. It looked like communication, like the entire forest was one enormous organism passing messages between its parts. Around midnight, they came for me. I heard them long before I saw them, footsteps coming from every direction, moving through the forest with purpose. But these weren't the slow, measured steps I'd heard the night before. These were quick, eager, like predators who had finally cornered their prey. The first one I saw clearly was Julie, or the thing that had been pretending to be Julie. She stepped out from behind a tree about 20 feet away, no longer bothering to maintain the illusion of injury. Her leg, which had been twisted and broken, now worked perfectly. But her face had changed. Her skin had a greenish tint, like chlorophyll showing through, and when she smiled, I saw rows of thorn-like teeth. "Hello, Benny," she said in that honey-poison voice. "We've been waiting for you to come back to us." Behind her, other figures emerged from the forest. Some looked human at first glance, but wrong in subtle ways. Skin that was too smooth, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, hair that moved like leaves in a breeze. Others had stopped pretending to be human altogether. They were tall and thin, with bark-like skin and fingers that ended in thorns. Their faces were beautiful and terrible, with features that seemed to shift and flow like water. "What are you?" I whispered. The Julie thing tilted her head. "We are what grows when the earth is fed with intention, instead of accident. We are what happens when plants learn to think, to want, to hunger." She took a step closer, and I saw that her feet weren't touching the ground. Roots and vines were supporting her, lifting her up and carrying her forward like a living throne. "The Tlingit knew us once," another voice said. "This one came from a figure that was more tree than human, with branches growing from its shoulders and leaves for hair. They fed us properly. They understood that all life requires sacrifice, that the forest must eat to grow strong. But they stopped coming," Julie said with a pout that would have been charming if not for those terrible teeth. "They built their villages far away and taught their children to fear the deep woods. So we learned to call to others instead. We learned to make ourselves beautiful, to offer what humans want most." "What's that?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Paradise," she said simply. "A place where everything is perfect and beautiful and nothing ever dies. Except you, of course. Someone has to feed the garden." The circle of creatures was closing around me now. I could see more of them in the trees above, hanging from branches like fruit, their eyes glowing in the darkness. And beneath my feet, I felt the ground beginning to soften. "We've been so hungry, Benny," Julie continued. "Do you know how long it's been since someone came to visit us? The last one was a Russian fur trader in 1943. He was delicious, but not very bright. You, though, you understand plants. You can help us grow, help us spread beyond this little valley." "Spread?" The word came out as a croak. "Oh yes. We've been learning from every person who visits. Learning about the outside world, about cities full of people, about gardens where we could grow unnoticed until we're strong enough to harvest entire populations." The ground beneath me was definitely sinking now. I looked down and saw roots erupting from the earth, reaching for my feet. Without thinking, I leaped onto the boulder behind me. "Smart boy," Julie laughed. "But stone won't save you for long. We're very patient. We've been growing here for centuries. We can wait until you're too tired to stand, too weak to resist." That's when I remembered my camp stove. I still had a full canister of fuel in my pack. Fire. Plants hated fire, even supernatural ones. I fumbled for the canister as the creatures pressed closer. The tree thing reached out with branches that extended like arms, trying to grab me. I clicked the igniter on the stove and held it like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted. The flame was small, but the effect was immediate. All the creatures recoiled, and the phosphorescent glow around me dimmed. Even Julie's beautiful mask slipped again, showing something plant-like and horrible underneath. "Fire can't save you forever," she hissed. "You'll run out of fuel eventually." She was right, but fire gave me an idea. I grabbed my pack and started moving, using the stove flame to keep the creatures at bay as I backed toward the stream. My water? Purification tablets were basically chemicals that released chlorine. Not enough to start a fire, but maybe enough to poison plants if I could get them into the water system. The creatures followed me, staying just outside the range of my tiny flame. They were toying with me, I realized. They could have overwhelmed me any time they wanted, but they were enjoying the hunt. I reached the stream and started dumping tablets into the water. The creatures laughed. "Clever," the tree thing said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "But this water feeds the whole valley. You'd need gallons of poison to affect us." But something was happening. The water around my tablets was starting to foam and bubble, and where it touched the banks, plants were beginning to wither. "Impossible," Julie snarled, but I could hear uncertainty in her voice now. I dumped more tablets, then grabbed my emergency flares from the pack. If I could set enough of the forest on fire, maybe I could create a break in their network, confuse them long enough to escape. The first flare burst into brilliant red light, and the creatures screamed in unison, a sound like a hurricane through a greenhouse. I hurled it into the nearest patch of glowing flowers, and they burst into flames with a whoosh that told me they were full of something highly flammable. The fire spread faster than any normal forest fire should, jumping from plant to plant in chains of light, and as it spread, I could feel something else changing. The oppressive weight in the air was lifting. The unnatural silence was breaking apart. "You don't understand," Julie screamed, her form wavering between human and plant. "We're connected to forests everywhere. If you kill us, you kill them all." But I could see she was lying. These things were parasites, not part of the natural order. They'd corrupted this valley, turned it into their feeding ground. The real forest, the one I knew and loved, was still here underneath, trapped and choking under their influence. I lit another flare and threw it deeper into the woods. More screams, more fire. The creatures were retreating now, their forms becoming less solid as the flames consumed whatever network connected them. "This isn't over," Julie called as she melted back into the shadows between burning trees. "We know about you now, Benny Grimwald. We know where you live, where you work. We'll send seeds on the wind, spores in the water. You can burn this garden, but you can't burn them all." Then she was gone, and I was alone with the fire, and the real forest finally beginning to breathe again. I spent the rest of the night feeding the flames, making sure the fire reached every corner of the valley where the unnatural plants had taken root. By dawn, half the valley was ash and smoke. But I could already see normal plants beginning to emerge from the soil. Real ferns, real moss, real flowers that stayed in one place and didn't watch me with hungry eyes. Jake found me 3 days later, sitting by the remains of my camp, writing everything down in my notebook. He said he'd been trying to raise me on the radio for 2 days, and when he couldn't reach me, he'd flown in to check. "Jesus, Benny," he said, staring at the burned valley. "What happened here? Lightning strike?" I looked at my notes, at the photos that had somehow survived in my camera, pictures of impossible plants and faces that weren't quite human. Then I looked at Jake's worried face, and I made a decision. "Yeah," I said. "Lightning, freak storm. I was lucky to get out alive." He believed me. Everyone believed me. What else could they do? My official report blamed the unusual plant growth on a combination of volcanic soil, unusual mineral content, and an isolated microclimate. The fire was listed as a natural occurrence. Lightning from a storm that I was the only witness to. But I kept the real notes, the real photos, and I started paying attention to reports from other rangers, other scientists, about places where plants seemed to grow too fast, too strange, too aware. Because Julie had been right about one thing: you can't burn them all. That was 62 years ago, and I've been watching ever since. I transferred out of Alaska the next year, told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery, maybe something in the lower 48 where the plants weren't quite so aggressive. He laughed and signed my papers, probably thinking I'd just gotten tired of the isolation. But I didn't stop being a botanist. If anything, I became more focused, more dedicated to understanding what I'd encountered in that valley. I spent my career moving from park to park, forest to forest, always watching for signs of what I now think of as the garden's influence. And I found them. Not full infestations like what I'd seen in Alaska, but traces. Isolated reports of unusually aggressive plant growth. Hikers who disappeared in areas where the vegetation had recently become more lush than usual. Small towns where the local flora started showing behaviors that didn't match any known botanical classification. I developed a network of contacts, other rangers, research botanists, even some indigenous elders who still remembered the old stories about places where the forest was hungry. We didn't talk about it openly, but we shared information quietly, keeping track of incidents that might be connected. The pattern became clear over the decades. Whatever those things were in Alaska, they weren't unique. They were just the most concentrated example of something that existed in small pockets all over North America, maybe all over the world. Ancient things that had learned to mimic beauty to lure and prey, that had been feeding on humans for centuries before we even had names for them. The Tlingit called them Kushtaka, shapeshifters who lived in the boundary between land and sea, between the human world and the spirit world. But every culture has stories about plants that hunt, forests that trap travelers, gardens where beautiful flowers hide terrible appetites. I retired from the Park Service in 1995, but I didn't stop investigating. I started a small private foundation dedicated to unusual botanical research. Officially, we study plant adaptation and evolution in changing climates. Unofficially, we track and contain infestations of what I call collector plants, because that's what they are, really, collectors. They gather human experiences the way some people collect butterflies, preserving them, studying them, feeding off them. The most sophisticated ones can replicate not just human appearance, but human memories, human personalities, everything that makes us who we are. They keep their victims alive as long as possible, harvesting not just flesh but consciousness, dreams, fears, hopes. The thing that pretended to be Julie Thornfield was probably decades old when I met her. She'd lured other researchers, other hikers, slowly building her repertoire of human behavior. If I hadn't been suspicious, hadn't run when I did, I would have become just another voice in her collection, another personality she could use to lure the next victim. I'm 91 years old now, and my traveling days are behind me. But the foundation continues the work. We have researchers in 12 countries, and our database contains over 3,000 documented cases of probable collector plant activity. We work with local authorities when we can, usually by providing expert botanical consultation on cases of missing hikers or unexplained vegetation growth. Sometimes we can contain an infestation early, before it grows large enough to threaten populated areas. Sometimes we're too late, and all we can do is monitor and wait for an opportunity to act. And sometimes, like what happened in that valley in Alaska, the only solution is fire. I know how this all sounds. I know how it sounded to me, back when I was a young man who believed science had answers for everything. But I learned that science is just a tool for understanding the world. And the world is far stranger than most of us want to believe. If you're a hiker, a camper, someone who spends time in the deep woods, learn to recognize the signs. Gardens that are too perfect, too organized, plants that seem to track your movement, flowers that bloom out of season or in impossible colors, forest clearings where there's no bird song, no insect life, nothing but beautiful plants that watch you with too much interest. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the very air seems to whisper your name, where beautiful strangers appear with convenient explanations and urgent needs for help, remember this: paradise is always a trap. The most beautiful gardens are usually the most hungry. Trust your instincts, trust the old stories, and never, ever trust a plant that smiles back at you. The Foundation's website is buried deep in academic search engines, listed under Botanical Survey Research Institute. If you ever encounter something that doesn't belong in any textbook, something that makes you question what you know about the natural world, find us. We're still watching. We're still fighting. Because somewhere out there, in valleys and forests and hidden groves around the world, the gardens are still growing, still hungry, still collecting, and they remember my name,